campaigner. So I really am absolutely delighted to welcome Dr. Mike Galsworthy.
What is all this project management nonsense? Just show some spunk, get around the world, shake a few hands. That's how deals are done. No, but seriously, this is really a key issue because, I mean, if you remember something like the IT system for the NHS, a big project, I think we've all had experiences of working on big projects that sort of get a little bit out of hand. Now, what we've got with Brexit is we've got multiple big projects running in parallel, stretching our resources beyond what our teams can do. And any one of those could go wrong. But then there is more, because, I mean, if you look at, for example, train crashes or plane crashes, you know, disasters like that, and you do the analysis of why they happened, it's because usually of various interacting factors that they hadn't modeled, because coincidences of things happening at the same time. So, think about the interaction between all the different systems that we're trying to leave at the same time. If you're trying to leave dozens of systems at the same time and they all interact with each other, you are begging for problems to happen. And me, in science, I'm looking at the whole things that layer onto science. I can't stay on top of it. And so when you're dealing with things where one individual mind working full time on it can't cover all the bases, then of course things are going to slip between the cracks. So it is a problem of complexity. Right, there we go. That's just me sort of like agreeing with you, and fantastic talk. And I mean, that's what is driving the world and driving nations is about. It's the technocrats doing the nitty gritty. You know, Boris can parade around with all of his pompous yada yada, but what makes a country run is people knowing what they're talking about, doing all the legal contracts, project managing things out, costing them, and being responsible. That's how countries are actually properly run. And our civil service at the moment is being ignored by some of these jokers. So anyway, lovely to be here and great to see all these Bath for Europe hats. The berets, that's awesome. I've seen some bollocks to Brexit stickers around as well. And lovely to hear that you've got a Pulse of Europe here. Maddie and I were in Frankfurt, when was it, 2 weekends ago? We were in Frankfurt, yeah, and at the Pulse of Europe big event there. So this kind of new community that we've got growing in the country, and then also linking over to Germany and France and the other European countries that are inviting us over to stuff. Maddie, there's something coming up in Poland that I can't do, so remind me to chat about this later, because they were asking about you doing it, and I said, yeah, I'm talking to Maddie tonight. Okay, so, but this sense of community, because one of the things that drove Brexit was also lots of abandoned communities where people felt powerless because they've seen their communities change, they didn't feel a sense of community, they didn't feel empowered. So I think an important answer to that is us building all of these grassroots communities that we have around the country where we can share ideas, share knowledge, come together, rebuild community, and communities that actually have power. That is important. So what I want to talk to you about today, this evening, is my areas, science and health and the NHS, but then also where we are at the moment with the whole process and what's going on with the people's vote and what's that all about, what's that drive, what's that ambition. So I'll do about 10 minutes on science, give you a quick sort of chronological skim through what's happened there so you feel armed about that, and then I'll do the same for health and the NHS, and then we'll go into the whole sort of process of where we are at the moment. Okay, so with science, I'm going to move around a bit. With science, it's absolutely key to economies. I mean, it's key to the quality of jobs. If you look at America, for example, there has been analysis done that has shown that since World War II, about half of the growth in the US economy is attributable to investment in science and innovation and technology. It really is the driver. Whereas there are lots of industries that you know, regularly produce sort of food or housing or keep things ticking over, science gets into everything and innovation gets into everything and improves processes and drives economic growth. And this is important in the UK, not just in the private sector, but also through our universities. Our universities here in the UK, we train up the world. We are the educators of the world. Look at our top universities. They are an export on our home soil, bringing in people from all over the world that not only spend money going to those universities, but also spend money in the local economies and also help network us up all over the world. That is massive soft power. But furthermore, think about local communities around this country. Where do their new jobs come from? It used to be the case that you've got big industries working in areas and there's jobs for life, and that's what's got the backs of the people there. You know, that there's that relationship. That is going in a lot of places. A lot of these industries can up and move quickly, but with universities you have something there that is anchored in that locality with real loyalty to that locality. A lot of modern universities were set up to support local communities, and they do it with education, and in the future they'll be doing it with more adult education and retraining, and they work with their local NHS hospitals, and they spin out businesses into the local communities. Oxford has just announced last year its 150th spin out. One of those, Oxford Nanopore, is now worth a cool $1 billion. But it's not just what they spin out into the local communities, it's the small businesses already there that can work with the universities for administrative help, for grants, for networking with other countries. So real bastions of our future economy. And when you have them supporting growth in communities, then it's not just for the scientists and innovation people. You know, when small businesses are growing, that's jobs for the security guards and the cleaners and the painter decorators and the local hospitality. You know, it's the Silicon Valley effect. You know, everything crowds in. So supporting British science, which is world leading, is absolutely vital to our future economy. And this brings me on to why the EU has been so helpful for UK science. Modern science is all about pulling the best together to work in those teams. So you should know that on the global scale, you know, we're increasingly networking up all over all of our countries. There are no foreigners in science. You go into labs anywhere around the UK or other developing countries, America or Germany, the labs will be full of people with lots of different accents from lots of different backgrounds. Everything is networked, everything is moving. And the output from our science in this country, about 62% now, is in collaboration with other countries. That is ahead of America, which is on 40%. But these collaborative relationships have extra value. 40% more impact in terms of citations. That means something to scientists. Citations is important. But in a 2013 report to the government, this was attributed to being the factor of why we have more impact than the US in terms of bang for buck, in terms of money spent. It's the fact that we're so well networked. So now on to Europe as a whole, well, the EU as a whole, driving Europe. The three big players in the world for science are the US, the EU, and China. But not in that order, because the EU is number one, then it's the US, then it's China. So in terms of number of researchers, it's the EU, then China, then the US. In terms of output, it's the EU, then US, then China. And in both of those cases, the gap between the EU and the US has been growing. And also in terms of high impact papers, the EU has now overtaken the US in recent years. So I'm talking about the EU as a single entity because that is how we operate. You know, we are a team, we are a hub. We have pooled money together, and we pool policy together, and we pool regulations together, and work as a hub that then goes on to connect with the rest of the world. And in fact, if you want to collaborate with America, an easy way to do it is on an EU grant, because it's such a solid basis. So this is something that uniquely we've got going in Europe for science, and it's brilliant. And we have been in the driving seat of this. So what does that mean for university fundings, for example? Okay, about 17% of our science grants in universities come from the EU. But it's not just amount, it's about that extra value that I mentioned before. And it is also the fact that the EU has been investing in science when our own government had been neglecting it. So 73% of the increase in UK university science fundings over the past years has come from the EU. So in terms of the growth, the increase, it's been that EU backing, as our own national investment has been stagnant. And also there are other grants that attract researchers from all over the world to work in Europe. But the main thing is that when you have all these countries pooling into a pot together, it just lowers barriers to working, and it means you can put together a pick and mix dream team of whomever you like across Europe in order to do those big multinational projects that you can't compete with elsewhere, because you need to pull countries together first and have the framework of agreement before you can do that. So that has really, really boosted us incredibly. So this is the case that the science community were making during the referendum debate, and we were pretty much all on board with that. So I wrote down here, so Paul Nurse and 13 other Nobel Prize winners wrote a letter about it. The late, great Stephen Hawking and 150 members of the Royal Society wrote about it. There was not one single university leader in Northern Ireland, Wales, Scotland or England that was for leave. We gathered a petition together of 5,500 scientists for Remain, and surveys show that about 85 to 90% of research community, including research engineers, thought that the EU was a major benefit for science and were supporting Remain. So that's where we were. When there was a vote for Brexit, there was immediate fallout. We know because we did a survey. We put it out to our members to see if there was any impact yet. And there was, in terms of being able to attract people in. There was a lot of that drying up. Some people said they would leave, a few did. There was investment freezes and job hiring freezes in a few places. And also, in terms of future collaborations with other European countries, there was a lot of disruption there because people didn't know where the UK was going to be. And all of these problems have sort of continued since that time, largely under the radar. Problems with hiring, problems with inward investment, problems in collaboration. So now our participation on Horizon 2020 has dropped from 15% down to 12%. So we're seeing all of these effects, as well as some big effects, like, for example, losing the European Medicines Agency, the Euratom problem, which came completely out of the blue, utterly unnecessary, amazingly wasteful in terms of costs, and just slowing things down. Problems with Galileo, you may have heard about. So even though the European Space Agency is outside the EU, it overlaps with the EU because the EU funds a lot of these big projects. And basically, if we don't have a defence contract with the EU, then why is the EU going to include the UK on sensitive defence-related stuff? So we're seeing some big fallouts as well already that has been, utterly unnecessary, purely triggered by Brexit. So where are we now with science? Well, Horizon 2020, which is the big funding program from 2014 to 2020, was guaranteed back in December 2017. We would pay until the end. We've got this deal that we'll pay until 2020, so we're good for that. But for the next program coming along, of course, our government wants to keep us as close as possible to the EU science program because they know all this stuff about, how useful it's been and the fact that we've been leading all these projects and it helps us attract some of the brightest talents around the world. The problem is that we've also been leading in policy on a lot of the shaping of European science. But if we're not in the Council and if we're not in the Parliament, then we don't get that official voice anymore. We're trying to, ask them to do favours from the sidelines. And we might even lose access to a few lines of funding. Basically, we are at the mercy of what the EU wants to craft. We will get a bespoke deal, but it's not bespoke as we want it. It's bespoke as the EU 27 look at this country and say, I rather like their scientists, we want to work with them, but maybe we don't want them to have the IP, and we don't want them to have as much networking and grant opportunities as we do. So that's what we're looking at. However, I will say one thing, because I like positives. In terms of the positives, finally, science is on the map with this government. because of the threats to it, because of our campaigns during the referendum debate, I believe, science is now central to this government's industrial strategy. Whereas in 2015, we couldn't get any of the major parties to lift us from the bottom of the G8 for science investment per GDP. In general election of 2017, they were all promising a doubling. So Lib Dems, Conservatives, and Labour were all promising a doubling of science investment. So Brexit has shaken things up and made this government look at sort of future economy and think, well, where are our strengths? Clearly in science and higher education, and Brexit's threatening it, so they're trying to counterbalance it with investment in new structures. Good. And if we can just remain, then that would be perfect. Now, the NHS and health, the NHS is not so fortunate. I mean, I rack my brains. I can't think of a single goddamn thing there where I can say, well, Brexit as a sort of side effect has helped this, because that's simply not the case. Let's dive straight into the Brexit dividend, or rather, there is no Brexit dividend. And I am glad that Theresa May tried to pull this fast one, because the ghost of the red bus had been bumbling along for a while, but not really overtly challenged until she decided to pop it out there again and pretend it existed. At which point, this was a few days back now, we just jumped in all with the line, there is no Brexit dividend, there is no Brexit dividend, and then explained it. So we all dived into that. And it's very clear why there is no Brexit dividend. Think about it in GDP terms. What is our net contribution that we are so keen to get back? It's about 0.5% of GDP, right? What has the hit been already to our GDP? About 2% growth over the last 2 years. So we've already burnt more money than we could claim back from this, but we haven't claimed it back. And we're not going to claim it back this year, or next year, or the year after, or God knows. But when we actually do, in order to claim it back, we have to pull the plug on the single market. You know, that's part of the process. Pull the plug on the single market, and by God, that's going to cost. I mean, and the government themselves admit that it's going to cost a cool 15 billion per annum. So if this is 10 billion per annum we get by spending 15 billion per annum, it doesn't sound like a wise trade-off, does it? So this is why there is no Brexit dividend. And we've been going on about this for ages. So I wrote in November 2015, when I was talking about this magical Brexit dividend and science, because it was being promised to science as well, you know, not just the NHS, science and potholes and farming and, you know, your mother and, you know, whatever she wants, you know, everyone can get some of this. I wrote, the attempt to financially gain is akin to killing the goose that lays a golden egg. It is a surefire short-term loss until at least a decade down the line, according to the most optimistic scenarios. Project Fear? No, this is exactly what's happening now. So, this is why, with the NHS and NHS funding, because Brexit is a loss-making process, we're going to have extra taxes to get back to even Stevens, to get back to level, before then having extra taxes and maybe also borrowing on top of that in order to fulfill this NHS pledge. That is the reality of the situation. But wait, as they say in infomercials, there's more. Because that is not the only financial cost to the NHS, there's also the fall in pound. Our NHS is a big beast, and it gets its supplies not just from the UK. So when the pound falls, all of the purchasing of drugs and materials and equipment from overseas, anywhere overseas, if the pound falls, shoots up in price. So it was estimated immediately after the referendum vote that this will cost about £900 million per annum. That's been very underreported, but that's where we are, because about half of our NHS equipment purchases come from outside the UK. And then there's more on top of that, because by our cross-border relationships with other countries for health compensation, if you're thinking about the populations in Spain and France and Ireland, for example, and their healthcare needs, if our NHS is recompensating for that, which they do, then that pushes up those prices as well, and I think that's been estimated at 100 million. So there's a cool billion right there. On top of that, there is, of course, the staffing problems, the most dramatic of which is the EU nurses. And here's the sad thing, right? For all this rhetoric about immigrants strain our NHS, they're draining our resources. There are two sides to the NHS. There's a demand side and there's a supply side. Now, on the demand side, EU immigrants overall are 5% of the population. That's small. But then they tend to be young and healthy and just arrived and wanting to work. And then when they get ill, well, they come from neighbouring countries, so often go back home to get the care there. The demand side for them is tiny. Now, on the supply side, they come over here, they contribute in taxes, or maybe they start up in businesses and hire locals that contribute in taxes while they pay on the company level, and then in terms of the NHS servicing itself, 5% of the population as a whole versus 7% of the nursing and home care workforce versus 10% of our doctors come from EU countries. It is supply side heavy. So it is not immigrants straining our NHS, it is immigrants leaving that strains our NHS. And we are seeing that now. And particularly with the EU nurses, you should know that from they've been plugging our gaps. So from 2013 until 2016, they were growing at about a 30% rate, whereas non-EU nurses and our home nurses were treading water, that weren't really getting anywhere in terms of numbers. So to put it another way, from 2013 to 2016, our NHS nurses increased by 19,000. Now, what proportion of that was EU nurses? Well, during that time, the number of EU nurses in our workforce increased by 21,000. So that means that they were plugging the fall and then adding all the growth. Now what has happened since the referendum is that they are not coming, that's dried up, and also those here are leaving. So now, in the last year, I think it's 3,000 to 4,000, I was trying to check the stats before, have left, and our own workforce and EU and non-EU nurses have increased by about 1,000. So we are seeing a fall now driven by the EU nurses leaving. And this is when we have 40,000 nursing vacancies. And we know the nursing to patient ratio is critical in terms of patient safety. So that's real impact just there. We're seeing a similar trend for doctors, but more mild. But the critical thing here is the nurses. And I think it's a really sad story. It's also a very human story that people in nursing and social care, those that come as fellow EU citizens, just like the Windrush came as fellow British subjects, to build our country with us as one of us, believing in this country, should now feel that after providing all this help, they feel alienated and they want to leave. And the knock-on effects are ridiculous because, of course, they come without any Tier 2 visa caps. So when our government spends millions on then trying to hire nurses from elsewhere, then hits a blockage of caps, which Theresa May won't lift, we are just chucking money away here on this process as well as hurting ourselves. And it goes beyond the finances, which Jeremy Hunt has admitted, and it goes beyond the nursing shortages caused by Brexit, or exacerbated by Brexit, which Jeremy Hunt has admitted. There's also the issues of the EMA loss. So we have lost this institution from London, but also if we don't stay within its framework, then we will get drugs into this country more slowly because we are a slow market. Switzerland and Canada get them more slowly than does the EU. There's also our cross-border healthcare agreements. If we don't shore those up, then that means when you travel abroad, you get private insurance to do so. If you've got an ongoing condition like you need dialysis or you've got serious diabetes, then that could cost a lot. And you've got lots of public health international agreements that are guaranteed by the EU at the moment, like, for example, clean air. If our government breaches it, our charities can go and take our government to court on that international agreement. That's a layer that could go. Euratom, I won't go into that, it takes too much time, but but it does jeopardize our frameworks, because we have frameworks in place that prioritize other countries within the frameworks, and if we come out of the framework, then we become deprioritized for some of these innovative new medical radioisotopes and methods, as well as the standard supply. And then finally, we have the trade deals threat, particularly with the US. And if you're thinking about our health, then there are two levels here. One is the quality of our food and chemicals, and we set much higher standards in Europe as a whole, our British European standards, than the Americans do. They would want us to tear those up so that they can come charging in, and they will push on that very, very strongly. The second threat is healthcare businesses have for a long time been chomping at the bit to get into the UK market, as they see. And just the drug companies don't like the fact that in Europe we have socialized healthcare, which means that on a governmental level we haggle about prices. In the American Wild West, the drug prices are absolutely huge in hospitals because the companies can play them. Donald Trump has already said that he wants Europe to be paying more their way in terms of drugs, and that means trying to make our NHS pay more and break that system down. And then there are the health insurance companies and health provision companies that see our market, of 120 billion per annum, and want a piece of it. And to get a piece of it, they will want to integrate with our politics to help set the agenda. These are real things coming down the line that will get bundled in a trade deal because it will be insisted on from the US end. Right, so what do we do about all of this grim scenario? Because it's not fun, is it? Right. Essentially, I think I should just dive in with the meaningful vote stuff, because that's the most recent stuff and you'll probably be curious about it. So in December 2017, Amendment 7 passed by just a few votes, and that meant that regardless of what the government negotiates, they have to bring it back to our Parliament, and our Parliament has to scratch its chin and says, do we sign off on this or not? So the recent twists and turns were essentially, well, okay, we've agreed that, but then if we say no, what happens next? So the House of Lords stuck a whole load of amendments on this withdrawal bill, a good 15 of them, and everything from the Brexit date to the customs union to the single market, and a whole set of them. And one of them was about this meaningful vote. And basically, if the government fails to satisfy the Parliament with the Brexit deal, then the Parliament itself can sort of take back control. God, I hate that phrase. Take back control of the process and determine what the government does next. So what happened was that didn't know if this was going to work or not. And then during the debate, there was a lot of support from the Conservative side for actually supporting this Lord's amendment, which was by Lord Hogg, and it was quite an aggressive one. It really, really, really gave Parliament a lot of regular control. And so this was a complete threat to the Conservative Party. So they then had, Theresa May had this gathering with Dominic Grieve where she said, listen, what you're proposing now is milder than that, and it's kind of acceptable, so don't blow things up now. I promise you that I will put it back through the Lords as a new amendment, which basically ticks this box. Well, did she do that? No. She then tried to slip in another version, which basically took the teeth out of it. So the Lord said, no, that's no good. And then they put in one that did the original purpose. And there's been some jiggery-pokery and wrangling. And you might feel dispirited about the fact that it didn't end with a big, fireworks and flare at the moment. But actually, rest assured that that meaningful vote is still there. And there are still teeth remaining in Parliament, and so it all comes down to now, basically, can the government bring back a deal that is going to be acceptable to Parliament and the people? And the interesting twist about this is that now that the government haven't been defeated on this, they can't claim that Parliament is tying their hands. They've got liberty to go and do their own deal, but they've kept Parliament out of it, which means that they've kept the other parties out of it, the other political parties out of it. So this is all on Tory heads at the moment. This is a Tory deal, And that gives us extra fuel now for demanding a people's vote. Seeing as it's going to be negotiated in only one flavour, we need to say, if you want to respect the result of the referendum and the will of the people and all that jazz, you need to prove that your own particular flavour checks out with all of us. And the way that would happen is that our parliament can go and keep rejecting their deal time after time after time, if they want to. And a get out for that for the government would be via a people's vote, and a brilliant opportunity for Labour would be to defeat the government and say, you've wasted the last 2.5 years, and now we want to see if the public agree. And that's their opportunity to do so. So that's the structure of what's coming up. So everyone at the moment, and this comes back to what you heard before, pretty much everyone at the moment can agree that Brexit is in a mess. It has gotten stuck in the briar patch. It has been 2 years and the government have got nowhere. Maddie and I were on Radio 5 Live this morning, and the Brexit dude that I was against agreed wholeheartedly that the whole process was in a mess and it was all being mismanaged and it was all being mishandled. Okay? So then the question is this. Let's say it all goes tits up. It all goes completely wrong. What do? You need a backup plan. Okay, great. Backup plan is we walk away, right? We just walk away. Walk away from all these frameworks we built up for 40 years, leave all those threads hanging. Problem with that is you can only do that if you've already primed your backup system. If you've already said, this is what we're going to walk away onto. Look, we can replace this and this and this and this and this. But our government haven't done that. So they're bluffing with nothing. More to the point, if they were to start trying to build something in time in order to back it up, they don't have the time to do it. And then let's say they did have the time to do it, it would cost money. They would have to divert money from NHS investment, from schools investment, from police investment, from the whole goddamn lot in order to build up the teams you need in order to replace the agencies, build up the customs facilities at the seaports and at the airports and all those things that you need to do, build the IT systems in order to support that. But even if the government wanted to do that, they couldn't do it by themselves because there's a whole load of private companies involved that actually run some of this large infrastructure that would need to be upgraded. So they would have to tell companies, you need to spend X amount of money in order to prep a backup scenario that we're hoping no one has to use, just so that we've got a haggling angle on what we're going to negotiate with the EU. Do you think that's going to go through with companies? They're just going to say, we're not spending that money. You make sure this doesn't go wrong, or we're walking. So that's why this whole we can just walk away thing is absolutely farcically wrong, and they've known it for a long time and gotten themselves stuck on it. So the real back out, the real escape from all of this is if the deal doesn't come through, or if the deal is patently rubbish, then you stay where you are and you just drop the deal off and you say, this doesn't work, this is going to be incredibly damaging. If you want to do Brexit, fine, but next time, come back with a bloody plan. And Brexit can be done, of course it can be done. You've got Article 50 as the door out. There have been other plans for a practical Brexit. The Flexit plan was very straightforward. As a first step, you come out into the single market and the customs union. That would probably take about 2 years to negotiate. From there, you can take a look-see, and then if you want to go further, then you would write further plans, step by step. Nice, sensible project management. But our crazy government didn't go and do that, did they? They got themselves stuck, and it's their own fault. So this is how we need to phrase and term the debate now. It's all very pragmatic. It's all very straightforward. To come back to what we were saying, we have all taken on projects before that got a little bit too big to handle. So what did we do? Did we trash our workplace and family over it? Or did we say, actually, I have learnt a bit of a lesson, I can come back to this later, and then, tidy it up in a sensible way? I'm a scientist. I do not mind experimentation. Experimentation is good and healthy, even sometimes when it's scary. Brexit is an experiment. The EU is a big experiment, and it's experimented with lots of things and got burnt here and there. And Brexit is also an experiment. It's testing something out. But when experiments start going wrong, and you can see them going wrong, like, for example, if you're running a clinical trial and you can see it's actually hurting people, it's actually causing damage, then you need a mechanism just to stop it. And I'm not saying you just need the option there. You need to build a safety path out to stop it. And that's all the people's vote is. It's just good, sensible step. Now, maybe a deal will be put down which is largely acceptable in terms of, some people think this looks wonderful. And maybe a lot of people will think, well, this looks a bit rubbish, but we're British and we said we'd cut off our arms, so we should do it. And in 120 years' time, approximately, we will feel good for it. Sure, some people will think like that, and that is their choice. But we should have that option because essentially, if you believe in it, and if you can make this argument, go for it. But it should be there as a sensible management thing. And at the end of the day, we are all learning from the experience that we go through. Okay, so no ill will to anyone is warranted. We are all learning, and the rest of the European countries are learning a hell of a lot from us at the moment. Because a lot of people didn't know about a lot of these frameworks and processes, and watching us going through it, they're going like, oh, so that's customs union, single market, EMA, oh God, lucky Amsterdam, I didn't know about that one, but that looks like a winner. And so we're all learning, and it's been really a shame that over the last 40 years, our government have not communicated the EU to the public particularly well. So our country has benefited from the EU in terms of our government's got real power within the EU, but when it makes decisions, it hasn't been asking our people about whether those decisions are good. Yeah, let's have Turkey join. Yeah, that will expand, because they're in NATO, without checking with people. And when our country as a whole has benefited from the EU framework economically, which it has not distributed those benefits well within the country. That's why we've got all these poor regions compared to the rest of Northwest Europe. So the country as a whole has strongly benefited from the EU, but there has been no education, there has been no discussion of this in the media, and then there has been no fair sharing of both the decision-making and the finances of this at the national level. And I think that is why we should be making the strong case, and I'm happy to make it at this stage, that we should ditch Brexit like a sack of potatoes and get on with a Remain, but also a reform programme which actually helps deliver all those things that communities around the country actually really need. And I'll stop there. No, and our experience should also be shared with the other European countries, because I do believe in solidarity, I do believe in working together, I do believe in neighbourhoods and communities, and so there's a lot that we've learnt from our experience that I would be keen to take back across the other countries and say, right, this is how you actually connect with your citizens and make sure they get the goods of a broader framework and they're on board with it, and you develop it productively. Okay, thank you.